Good morning to you all. Happy Monday, our last week of English 1150. Thank you so much for your your collaborative reading comments from last week. I'm kind of sitting in the margins watching a lot of these conversations happen, and I'm doing that because I'm really enjoying kind of the back and forth replies, comments that I'm seeing. Some of the questions and some of the observations you're making are things I haven't noticed before either, and so I'm happy that you're kind of, without sort of my guidance or sort of pointing you in a specific spot, finding places in this literature, really digging in and kind of making a passage your own or sort of analyzing it on your own has been really helpful to me. I gave you two short recaps here if you'd like to listen to them, the Secret Life of Walter Mitty recap and then the Yellow Wallpaper recap. While they both kind of overlap in certain ways because you were considering how one may be informed or sort of speaks to the other, I did make some specific comments for each of the short stories as well. There were just a few of you that I emailed about our last slide deck, which was fantastic. You've done a great job archiving. I'm looking through the archival material for Charlotte Perkins Gilman and also for going through and crafting things for James Thurber, picking out some of his sketches and trying to identify how that maybe ties in with his literary output. And so a few of you just had unnamed slides, so go back through if you have a 0 for your slide deck. That just means I didn't know if you submitted one. If you had a name attached to the two, there were actually two in the slide deck that didn't have names. So if that's one of you, please email me and let me know so I can get that finished up for you. I'm also continuing through your discussion board posts, and I will have comments for all of you by Tuesday. So thank you for submitting those, and I hope some of you took advantage of the extra day because I'm not sure what happened with Blackboard, but it wasn't available for a certain amount of time, and thanks to those of you who let me know that that was the case. This week, we're coming back full circle, coming back to thinking about specifically the anatomy of endings, a short story ending. And if you remember from the beginning of class, we defined short stories as usually defined as a brief fictional prose narrative, most often involving one unified episode. Early in the 19th century, Edgar Allan Poe, who we're going to read today, was one of the first to attempt an analysis of the short story's aesthetic properties. So for example, what does a short story consist of? What's some of the terminology we can use to describe a short story? And some of that terminology we didn't have or didn't sort of exist as sort of coherent as it is today. And so Edgar Allan Poe came up with this idea of unity. He stressed the unity of effect as the story's most characteristic feature. So what exactly does unity mean? Does it refer to sort of a full episode, or what contributes to this idea of unity or the short story sort of adding up to one larger idea? And so I want you to be thinking about that this week as we read two short stories by the sort of very famous short story writer Edgar Allan Poe. It's sort of obligatory that we include these sort of short stories in here so you get a little taste of these kind of canonical texts this week. Edgar Allan Poe was one of the first and the earliest writers to discuss the aesthetic qualities. In other words, what makes a short story appear the way it does, feel the way it does. And he sort of talks about them as a distinct prose narrative form, so different from a poem or a novel, for example. In his day, literary criticism was still a new field, lacking in terminology and developed concepts. So he had two long reviews praising the tales of Nathaniel Hawthorne, where he published in Graham's magazine in 1842. And so they're examples, these early examples of how literary analysis is working, the things that you're doing in your collaborative reading exercises. In the following excerpt taken from an 1842 piece, Poe talks about his theory of the short story and his views of the nature of originality in literature. So here's a brief excerpt from Poe himself. A skillful literary artist has constructed a tale. If wise, he has not fashioned his thoughts to accommodate his incidents, but having conceived with deliberate care a unique or single effect to be wrought out, he then invents such incidents. He then combines such events as may best aid him in establishing this preconceived effect. If his very initial sentence tend not to the outbringing of this effect, then he has failed in his first step. In the whole composition there should be no written word of which the tendency, direct or indirect, is not to the one pre-established design. And by such means, with such care and skill, a picture is at length painted, which leaves in the mind of him who contemplates it with a kindred art a sense of the fullest satisfaction. The idea of the tale has been presented unblemished, because undisturbed, and this is an end unattainable by the novel. Undue brevity is just as exceptionable here as in the poem, but undue length is yet more to be avoided. And so here he's kind of talking about leaving this sort of effect or this impression, and how is that done in a short story? How is that different, for example, or similar to a poem or a novel? He says undue brevity is just as exceptionable here as in the poem. So we are thinking about when you embark sort of on these two short stories today, I'd like you to be thinking about this idea of one single effect. And I've given you for our collaborative reading some preliminary guidelines. You're going to be reading The Telltale Heart, which was written in 1843, and The Cask of Amontillado in 1846. And I want you to be thinking about how he constructs his ending for his readers, his sort of unity of effect, unity of endings. Do you find this kind of ending and build-up provides closure? Who is the narrator and what is the motivation for these confessions? Each of these short stories is written in a kind of confessional mode. Use these questions to guide your comments and replies for this week. Please include at least one comment for each short story by Wednesday and one reply for each short story by Friday. By Wednesday and Friday. So you're actually only adding 2 comments and 2 replies, but absolutely feel free to add more if you'd like. You've been doing so great without. I've also included 2 pieces of scholarship here. This one in particular, Dern, I think John Dern discusses some of the rhetoric of both of these short stories together, and I think it's an excellent essay I wanted to read to you. Just a little preface before you get into the short story, something to think about to frame your reading. Some rhetoricians claim that there's an important connection between being heard publicly and being accepted as a human being. And each of these narrators desires to use language to be accepted as a human being once again. They both severed their links to humankind when they committed the most horrendous of crimes, murder. Thus the confession each offers his auditor, an impromptu speech in The Telltale Heart, and an extemporaneous one in The Cask of Amontillado, is designed by Poe to advance an intriguing argument to the listening confidant and, by extension, to society in the hope of exploiting a connection between one's humanity and public speaking. Drama arises partially from the doubt Poe leaves about his speech's persuasive efficacy in terms of capitalizing on this connection. And so at the end of these short stories, you have to ask yourself the question, are you convinced by these confessions? Do you believe in the sort of humanity of these characters? Have they redeemed themselves? And if they haven't, why not? What sort of rhetorical effect did Poe embed so that we are sort of maybe uncomfortable with accepting these confessions, or we're happy to accept these resolutions? And again, so if you get a chance to sort of skim through this article, it's a great example of sort of an analysis of both of these short stories in terms of this question of efficacy, in terms of their ability to convince or not convince us of the sort of narrator's confessions. For our final slide deck this Wednesday, please I share a slide that contributes or showcases a literary example, a short story, poem, play, film, song lyrics, continuation novels, adaptations, fan fiction that imagines and or continues and or revises the ending to the text that it imitates. And so here's just a few short examples. The film Groundhog's Day, The Three Pigs by David Weisner is a children's story, and Henry James's short story Paste. It's sort of a reworking of the necklace, not necessarily a revision of the ending. See my first slide under Unit 5 to ensure that you include all the details. And so again, these examples can come from any sort of experience outside of this class, or it could be, thinking about any adaptations of short stories we've read in this class. But what I'd like you to do is first read this article by in the New Yorker. It's called An Anatomy of Endings, and it makes a really nice point about the fact that we are sort of similarly experiencing these endings in sort of real time. Endings haunt us because they're mortality formalized. They give us a simulated symbolic version of our own endings, which are either the clincher, which the author explains kind of what that term is. He uses his own sort of terminology to describe different kinds of endings. Sudden and unexpected and ironically right, or else the closer, the deathbed gathering. The grim trick, of course, is that as long as we maintain the sense of an ending, it isn't over. In life, we are all sitting in the diner, listening to Journey as the Reaper in a tracksuit and sneakers slides across the linoleum floor. Like Tony in the diner, and he's talking about The Sopranos here. He uses this as an example in his article. Our consciousness is incapable of its own closure. Endings are what life cheats us of. As long as a sense of the ending hovers, the story goes on. We close the book, leave the theater, shut off the screen, and return to the world. Bewildered maybe, but still breathing. In this way, a bad finish is a great gift. Indignation at an unsatisfying ending being the surest sign of life. And so, whether or not you kind of buy into that, I think that's sort of a great observation about how sort of our impression of endings kind of mirror or reflect certain expectations we have about our own mortality. And so in the slide deck, if you can add in a literary example, it can be a song lyric, it can be from a novel, where you see a particular ending happening, and then a sort of comparison text, maybe an adaptation of that song, reworking of that song, fan fiction sort of building from a particular text, making a new ending. I'd like to kind of see that overlap there, how someone is perhaps reimagining an ending. Because, as you might guess, your sort of final assignment, your final discussion board post and Google Site page is going to be a crafting a short story ending. And what you're going to be doing is taking a short story that we've already read. I'm really excited about this project. Taking a short story we've already read or that we are reading, so feel free to use Edgar Allan Poe short stories, and you're going to craft an alternative ending. About 100 to 200 words, so it's not going to be very thorough, very developed. But I'd like you to kind of imagine a different way out of the short story, and I think a lot of these short stories lend themselves well to reimagined endings, especially because of their brevity, especially because of maybe the way they're satisfying or unsatisfying to particular readers. And some of you have been commenting upon those endings as we've progressed through this class. Please post your short story by this Wednesday. And have commented upon 4 peer endings by Friday. So again, just a very short reworking of one particular short story ending. If you could also, next to your written ending, as you kind of just copy and paste it into your Google Site page, if you could do a quick reading of that so we can kind of hear maybe an emphasis or particular specific phrasing that you have for that short story, I would really appreciate it. Make sure to begin with the original author's last sentence before yours is introduced so that the story moves seamlessly between the original and your own. And so to this final recording, could you add one more thing for me, especially since this is our last project? I'd like you to address some, but not all of the questions below. So just cut yourself off after 1 minute. But I'd like you to just kind of reflect on the actual modifications that you've made. So why did you choose this short story, for example? And why these modifications? And that could be the only question you answer. That's perfectly fine. But perhaps some of these other questions speak to you more. Make sure to use terminology from our terms and concepts slide if possible. Quote directly from the short story you're choosing for further examples and evidence of why you made these modifications. And you might say something about a particular theme or a particular habit of a particular character or setting. And make sure to explain the ending in detail. What is satisfying or unsatisfying about the ending and why? Why did you make the choices you did? How did reading these short stories and learning about their formal elements help you craft this particular ending? And so as best as you can, try to imitate, try to mimic that specific language of the particular short story and author that you're temporarily inhabiting at that moment. And I'm really excited to kind of see some of these imaginative new endings as you sort of return to or experience these short stories anew. So thank you so much for your wonderful ideas this semester, all of your contributions. Especially outstanding were your collaborative reading comments. And I'll sort of be adding a final note on to the end of our class as we near the end of the week. Please email me if you have any questions or concerns, and I will be getting you feedback as soon as I can. I'm working on them and enjoying your discussion board posts from last week currently. As you finish this final week, if you wouldn't mind sending